Hello everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Can you guys hear me okay? Let's just do a quick sound check. I hope everyone is staying healthy and safe. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just open it up for questions really quickly. So if you guys have any questions, go ahead and just type it in the chat box and I will address them. The new lessons are available. This is our final week for lessons, but our critiques are going to continue. This is critique 5, so we have 2 more critiques after this as you guys move forward in your painting, but all of the lessons are available. So wherever you are in your painting, that's perfectly fine. Just keep moving forward with your lessons as best as you can. So does anyone have any open questions before we start our critiques? Thank you, Colin. I'm glad you could hear. I'm glad you got the link too. I had sent it out this morning instead of last night. Thank you, Rosa. Okay. If nobody has any questions, we're going to go ahead and just jump in. And if you have a question, just kind of keep it in mind, just write it down, and we'll open it up again for questions at the very end. Like I mentioned before, there is our final lesson this week where we do our detailing. So there is a lecture on organizing detail and also, of course, the main demonstration where I bring the rest of the painting up to that level of finish. And I also talk about how to, some techniques you might want to use when you're trying to determine, when your painting is finished at the end, how I oil out the whole painting and take a look at it one last time. I know some people have had questions about varnish, and I haven't varnished the painting yet because I'm letting it dry really well, but I'll try and post a bonus video either on YouTube or somewhere else, maybe in our community forum, showing how I go about varnishing, and I'll give a couple of tips on varnishing. I know I did this for a previous class, so if you were in that one, it's going to be pretty much repeat information, but I thought I'd offer it for this class as well. So Rosa, you had a quick question. Can I discuss how each layer I make the details? Glazing covers somewhat, and it seems that we're making some of the same detailing. Okay, I see what you're saying. So, like, how much detail do you determine is necessary for the underpainting and grisaille versus color? If you look at some of the detail that I added, for example, in the jug, there were some details that I left out in that grisaille layer because I knew I'd be moving forward with color. So I think of it as, when we're working, I've talked about big form modeling and then small form modeling. What I'm talking about is, for example, on a jug, the big form modeling would be getting that volume of the overall jug, pretending like it's smooth, and just getting that overall form and the values to read. That second form modeling is where you go in and you refine some of the highlight shapes. If there's any ridging or texture, in the case of the jug, there was a glaze on there that I indicated in the grisaille stage. And you could wait to do that in the color stage if you wanted, but because it had such a graphic element, I decided to do it in the grisaille stage. And the glaze was black in the paint, in the actual jug, so I just decided to do it in the grisaille stage. I do go in and further detail that glaze effect on the jug later. So moving into color, the first glaze layer was to establish, almost like thinking back to oversimplification. We're trying to establish the overall hue, and we have the values, so we're trying to establish the overall hue or color of each object. And it's really ballpark. And then in the second or third color layers, however many you want to do, then you're just tweaking the color, and you'll notice when I went back into the jug, I was adding the little specks of light. I mean, and those are really, really fine details. And I was refining the temperature hue of the highlights. I was paying attention to more subtle, kind of specular details and textures. And I would not have thought about those things in the grisaille stage because I knew I was going to go into it in the color stage. The same goes for like when I go in and you will see me paint the apple. I go in and I put some of the little specks from the skin of the apple. I actually pump up the chroma, so that second layer you are introducing something called a scumble, and that is that semi-opaque color layer. I'm also intensifying some of the colors or the chroma with further glazes because you might notice that your first glaze looks kind of muted, and that's okay. That's because if you think about it, you're almost just applying a color filter in front of your values. And so sometimes it needs to be built up in multiple layers, and sometimes you might find your underpainting was a little dark and you need to go back in and brighten it up with some scumbles as well. And so, how much detail you put in your underpainting is really up to you. And in this technique, I brought it to more of a finish because it's a great technique for people wanting to learn how to oil paint and achieve those almost stained glass effects that really luminous effect that the old masters were able to achieve. Just a side note, one of the reasons the old masters used a underpainting technique for oil painting, there were a couple of reasons, but one of them was that certain colors were really rare and expensive. They only had certain, like they had vermilion red. They had a very limited range of pigments, and their most expensive pigment was often the blue. And it was actually if you've ever worked with lapis lazuli, I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce it, but it's the original blue that you see in a lot of the old master paintings. It's a really finely ground stone, but it's actually very faint, like compared to something we use today, which is a very similar color, is ultramarine blue. But our ultramarine blue is much more highly concentrated of a pigment. So if you mix that lapis into white, it barely tints the color. So one of the ways to get the most out of the pigment and to make it go the furthest was to use glazing. And think of it like you're applying it to glass. The light is going through, stained glass. The light is going through the transparent layer, hitting the opaque ground or opaque underpainting and bouncing back out to our eyes. And that process is creating that richness of color. So one of the reasons they used that technique was the earth pigments were much cheaper. It was much easier to create what's called a dead color layer or a grisaille to get the forms, and then they could use a very small amount of their precious pigments to achieve the colors that they wanted. We don't have that problem. However, the use of that technique creates very luminous paintings, but it also creates very unique textures, and it gives you opportunities to create subtlety in your painting that a direct alla prima approach does not. That's not to say that alla prima can't be subtle in its own ways, but this technique just achieves a certain look and a different kind of level of finish. So I hope that helps answer your question. I probably went a little bit on a tangent there, but I get a lot of questions like, why would the old masters use glaze why would you do this technique instead of just going in and painting full color? And many of you might know that in my personal work, typically I do go in with an underpainting, but it's a little bit more like our first tonal sketch, where it's a little more less finished, and then I go back in with more opaque color and develop my painting from there. However, using this technique, sometimes I will go in with a full closed grisaille when I want to achieve some of the effects that we had in our painting for this class. So I vary up my technique a little bit depending on the effects that I want to achieve, and also depending on the timeline I have. If I have a tight deadline, I might not do such a refined underpainting and develop more in the color layers. It really just kind of depends on what I want. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into the critiques. We'll start with you, Penny. And I know you had a lot of questions, and thank you for letting me address them in here. Part of the reason I wanted to do that was because I think other people might have this similar question with regards to how do you approach your glazes if your colors are different from what I'm doing in mine. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. First, I would like to talk about where you brought your painting up to in the grisaille. And first I wanted to say that that flower looks excellent. You really, really improved it like tenfold from last week. I think that simplification that you achieved here in that shadow, and it has that real graphic description of what's in light and what's in shadow, but you still have some of those delicate reflected lights or lights or areas where the light is coming through, translucency. And so moving forward, you will be glazing those shadows with probably a more chromatic, transparent color than the lights. But remember, the first glaze layer should be pretty simple. So you were asking me about, well, I'll get to your questions in a minute. Let me just go ahead and finish a couple of suggestions for your grisaille. I think this looks really good, and I think you are ready to move into color. Things can be further tweaked as you move into color. So I think, you know, the level of detail that you have in this is perfect. I like that you softened out all of these shadows and this reflection, and you can see now how it does not compete. There's no confusion about what's a reflection and what is, you know, the physical object in space. By lightening the contrast here and softening those edges, it really pushed this pot behind the bird, and the same goes for this reflection here. We can really see that pushed behind. So I think you did an excellent job with that. Do you have any specific questions for areas on your grisaille? Besides color, we'll talk about that in just a minute. If you're wondering too, I had a couple of people ask, like, how do you handle background? You'll see as I go back in with that third color layer on my background or on the tablecloth, I'm further refining it, but I'm also deepening shadows, or I'm smoothing out some of my gradients a little bit with the glaze colors. So if you're worried about there being some irregularity, I wouldn't worry about that too much, because it can easily be smoothed out in the color layer. Okay, so I think you're ready to move into color. So let's go ahead and talk about some of your questions. So I'm just gonna take this away real quick, and we're gonna just talk a little bit about, I just copied and pasted your whole email. I hope you don't mind. So you said, you noticed I used primary colors for my glazes, which worked with my subject matter. So let me see, I might need to pull up a color version of your still life. Or remind me, what color is the flower? I don't have the color version in here. So, let's see. So you said the flower and the ceramic sugar bowl are pastel. You're not sure how to approach glazing pastel colors. Transparency will be negatively effective once white is added to the mix. So yes, so for your first, okay, the flower is pink. I thought so, but I wasn't sure. Okay, so for your first color layer, you want to go for pretty much a single color glazed over each object. So for example, I would not use an opaque color like yellow ochre, even though it's very close to the color that you have here. Let me move this layer up. On the jug here. So you said that looks like a yellow ochre to you. I would agree with that. However, yellow ochre is an opaque color, and so that's going to kind of create a frosted look, and it's actually going to go kind of green over the top of your grisaille. So, and that kind of happens with yellows in general too, especially if it's on the darker side. The darker the grisaille is, and you glaze a yellow over it, even a transparent yellow, it has a tendency to pick up some of that gray and it looks kind of green. So there's a couple of ways we can get around that. But for your first color layer, I would recommend staying with the Indian yellow, a transparent yellow. But to make it more pastel, think of this like watercolor in a sense. You dilute it more with medium to make it a lighter. Just like with watercolor, you dilute more with water to lighten up your colors. You're going to do the same when you're glazing. So to get this pastel yellow or this pastel blue, you're going to use ultramarine blue, and you'll probably use Indian yellow. This Indian yellow might go Hansa yellow. Let me think about that. I'm not sure. Look on the back and see if it says it's a transparent or semi-transparent. If it says that, then you can use it. So if you don't have an Indian yellow, that's okay. There are other yellows out there that are more transparent. Now the yellow might be more on the green side or it might be more on the red side. And in this case, you might want a yellow that's more on the red side. And one of the ways you can test that is just take a clean scrap of canvas or even paper and just thin out the color with medium. Okay, then Hansa yellow, I think you could use it. I'm not 100% just because I don't use that color, but what I would do is have a scrap piece of cheap canvas next to you, and then take each color that you want to use for your glazes and then experiment with diluting it with medium more and more, and then do like little swatches on that white canvas. And the reason for white canvas is it's going to show you how that glaze gets lighter with more medium, and it also will show you kind of the tendency for a color to shift one way or another as it becomes more transparent. So some colors will get warmer the more you spread them out or thin them out. For example, Indian yellow looks very orange out of the tube when you just like squeeze it out. But sometimes when you thin it out with medium, it tends to go a little bit more of like a rich yellow, almost like a green yellow. And it really kind of depends on the brand that you're using too. So this is one of the ways you can test that just on a scrap canvas, so you're not doing it on your painting. And to get that more pastel, then you just thin it out more with medium. If your yellow is more on the green side when it thins out, add a little bit of transparent red oxide. And that transparent red oxide is going to make it just a little bit more red-orange, so that way when it thins out, it takes on kind of this golden color. And I would just do a single color over all of the lights and the shadows. Don't worry too much about mixing a separate color for those shadows versus those lights. And it might be a little bit chromatic at first, but I would wait until you've glazed kind of a color over everything, because then next week you can go in with a semi-opaque and re-hit some of these highlights in your subject. Or so in yours you do have these reflections when it comes down into the blue area. So I would do just again that single glaze color of that blue, and then you can go back in the second layer, and where you might be able to spot glaze like the orange, you know, in your pot reflections. In here, I would definitely spot glaze those colors. Spot glazing is just where you're not applying a broad glaze over the whole thing. You're just glazing a specific area. So that's how I would suggest going about that. Now this blue is probably not just straight ultramarine blue. This is kind of a blue violet, and ultramarine blue is a blue violet, but I'd say I sense a little more pink in this color. So you might take ultramarine blue and add a little bit of an alizarin color, just a very small amount. Some type of alizarin color. You can use the quinacridone or anthraquinone red. It depends on what you have, or if you have like a quinacridone rose or something, a cool transparent red is what you want. And if you mix those two together, mostly blue with a touch of the other, you should end up with a nice color like this, and then just dilute it really well with your medium for that first layer. For your pink flower, again, same thing. You can go in, if you have a cool pink flower, then, or if it's like more of an orange, you have to determine if that's going to be more on the warm side or on the cool side. But remember, you want to use transparent, so you can't use cadmium red, but you could use the transparent red oxide, which is a red orange, combined with alizarin crimson or a cool red, to find the right tint and the right hue for that glaze. And again, I would do all these tests on a scrap sheet. And I don't know if you've received the book yet, the physical book, but if you look at the ebook version, you see me do that for as an example for the persimmon demo in that book. So you can see how I was testing out the glazes on a scrap sheet of canvas, and that will kind of demonstrate how you might go about that on here. So even though I am working with a primary palette, if I'm going to glaze the orange, I would just mix my transparent yellow. So for you, that would be your Hansa yellow, mixed with a little bit, maybe a red oxide if it's more on the warm orange side. And then you would glaze your oranges with that color. Yeah, you'll see where I'm mixing the glazes with a palette knife for that particular demo, and then I go in and do some tests on a scrap canvas to see how the colors dilute with more medium. Okay, so let me look through here. So you're wondering if you glazed shadows or more opaque tints in the lighter areas. So that's where you are here in the questions. So no, just in this first layer, just use transparents, because the idea is just to take our painting from being black and white to color. So even if the colors aren't 100% accurate, just get them in the ballpark, because it's going to help you start to see the direction that your painting's going to go. If we went in and started getting really detailed with our glazes and tried to be hyper specific, you're going to put us in a lot of work, and then you might find that when you put in another color next to it, it changes the feeling of that color. And so you noticed that probably in my painting, that first background that I'd put on, it felt very cool when I first put it on because of that warm grisaille. But as soon as everything else was glazed, excuse me, that background was very yellow. So I went back in and I cooled it off by glazing further blue in it, and I also added some semi-opaque scumbles to that background to cool it off. And I did that also, you'll see this week in the tablecloth. I'm really pushing that viridian green color in that tablecloth. So there is going to be opportunity to apply some of those semi-opaques, but I would wait until your second color layer to do that. So I'm going to jump down here because we already talked about, so you asked, do the color reflections on the bowl get added before the color of the bowl itself? I would say the only ones that you want to worry about is if this orange, or if there's something drastically different than the main color of the body on the bowl. Same goes for the metal, even though the metal is a direct reflection of its environment. So you're going to be more specific maybe with your glazes in this, because you're going to have the flower reflecting, you're going to have the oranges, and you'll have the green, or sorry, the blue bowl. So do you leave the rest of the picture alone? It depends on your background color. So whatever you decide on your background color, that is going to get glazed into the reflections on the picture. So just take a look at what the colors look like. If they just look black and white to you, you can leave them as the underpainting. They might end up with a cool glaze, but it's not necessarily going to be that drastic. Let's see, the background. I would just start with whatever color you're going to put in the background. And let me pull up your grisaille here real quick. So you could smooth out some of the background, but I would just wait until, I would apply your first transparent glaze and then wait until you do the opaque scumbles to smooth out your background. So maybe the second color layer, then you might go in and smooth out your background. And then your question down here, the color photo, both the bird and the orange have a small area outside of their shadows where their local color reflects off the white cloth. Are you talking, so you're talking about like here where there's a shadow on the white cloth itself, or the orange here? Well, since you're painting white cloth, white is very similar to like a metal object in the sense that it tends to reflect its environment. So in that case, I would go ahead and add a little bit of color to those cast shadows. It will help to, again, move that towards the finished painting. And also, you might even, if your grisaille feels too warm and your cloth is more on the cool side, you might consider doing a very faint cool glaze over it, like a cool blue or whatever. And it could just be spot glazing, like if the shadows need to be cooler. But for the white cloth, sometimes I just leave that until you've added color everywhere else, because you might find that the grisaille actually works just fine, and all you need to do is add some cooler scumbles and it'll feel like white cloth. Okay, so I hope I answered all of your questions. Do you have any other ones that popped up? So I'll just reiterate while I'm waiting for you to type if you have any other questions. Oh, okay, perfect. Yeah, so everyone, if you guys are doing a different still life than my demonstration, just remember that with a primary palette, you can mix pretty much any color that you need. But if you need a color that's outside of that, sometimes it does help to pull in a green, for example, like a sap green. I don't tend to use it that much. But if you find that you're just not able to achieve what you want, then you can pull in another color from outside of that spectrum. Just do those tests on that glazing. And if you're not sure if the color is transparent or opaque, one of the ways is to test that by applying it over a darkened canvas. So if it's darker, and the color is transparent, you won't see it get lighter very much. If it's semi-opaque or semi-transparent, you'll see it affect the dark ground differently. So there's different ways you can kind of test out your glazes. And sometimes I will pull in a color that I don't always include on my palette. In this case, I used a Viridian green because it was almost a perfect color match for my tablecloth. And it would have been hard to get that same feeling with a limited palette of the ultramarine blue and like mixing a yellow into it, like Indian yellow. That would have given me too saturated of a green, and I really needed that specific green that Viridian gives me. So if you find that the ultramarine blue does not work, and you need like a blue-green, try a phthalo or a transparent turquoise. Just make sure that those first colors that you apply are transparent, and save the opaques for that second color layer. All right. Thank you so much, Penny. This looks fantastic. I really look forward to seeing your painting next week. All right, Kathy, let's go ahead and talk about your painting. So let me pull up your email real quick and see if you had any specific questions. So you said you redid the table, but you haven't added the lights and the green. You also ended up retiling the entire cup, but you haven't put in the straight lines on the table yet. Okay, so you didn't really have any specific questions. Yeah, I think your underpainting looks really good. With the exception of 1 or 2 areas, I think you're ready to move into color. I think here you could probably lighten this area a little bit more. Let me grab a paintbrush here. So I would just to bring a little bit more contrast to the orange over here. And I worry a little bit about maybe these oranges getting a little on the dark side after glazing, because sometimes an orange, because you're using a dark red to make that orange color, they could end up a little bit too dark in the end. So you might consider just lightening the oranges 1 or 2 value steps, just a little bit, so that way, especially in the light areas, that way they glow a little more by the time you add your transparent glaze. Because it's very easy for, when you're glazing a dark color, it really pushes it dark. Again, it's like adding that color filter in front, and so it's going to make your painting darker. And it's very easy to make your underpainting too dark, and then you have to do a lot more work later with the scumbling to go in and correct that. So I would say maybe even bringing up, just doing a very thin scumble over like this area. And just brighten up some of these forms a little bit more. And it won't take that much work because it's just a thin, like I said, a thin scumble. But that's going to just give it enough light value so that way when you go in, this isn't going to mimic the glaze very well, but I think I have a glazing brush here. That way when you go in with your overall orange color, it doesn't, of course you might not glaze over, the white pith. You might just let those kind of stay. They're going to look a little gray, but then we'll brighten them up with a little bit of opaque white later. But you can see how that's going to kind of have that luminosity once you glaze your color over it. You might even consider that just a little bit for this orange. Again, same kind of idea. Just over the lightest areas. Just a very soft, so maybe take the value that it is and then just add a tiny bit of white and just push that value a little bit brighter. That way when you glaze, you have that nice glowing color underneath. One thing I want you to just pay attention to is that really sharp edge that happens here. One of the ways you can help soften that is to take a darker color and just do a very thin tile. I would oil out first between the background and the orange, but then just do a very thin tile along that edge and tiling a darker value in between and then blending it into the orange a little bit. It just gives the illusion of a softer edge without you having to overblend that edge. So you can kind of see how that helps to give it a little bit more volume. And I would look for same opportunities. It's okay to have a little bit sharper edge maybe up here, but down in here, maybe tile in, again, a darker mid-tone where it turns down towards the table. Just a little bit along that edge to help it turn a little bit softer. Okay, so that's a good question, Kathy. So what about the veiny white of the orange? So whenever I'm painting oranges, I usually save that for the very end. So that would be a second color layer detail. That'd be a finishing detail. So I would concentrate on getting the orange color glazed. Then you can go in later on once that's dry, and you can add some semi-opaque oranges to kind of brighten up some areas, and then you can add that white pith or those little veiny areas in the painting using glazes and scumbles in the second layer. So kind of leave it more in the simplified version at first. And then you can go in and scumble those over the orange, and it will have that same feeling of that pith sitting over the top of that really luminous orange. So a great example would be in this area here. If you glazed an orange color over here, over this area, even though there's white pith there, okay, so let's say you've glazed all of this, with the exception of this little white part in the middle. You've glazed everything with that deeper orange color. Then you want to go back in your second layer and add that kind of cooler white to the pith here. So you could do that with a scumble, and then you can also start to go in and over the top of that orange, scumble in some of that veiny texture, and it's going to show that almost the way I painted the grapes. It's going to show that little bit of orange underneath where you let it show through, and it's going to give you that kind of opaque versus rich, transparent orange feeling. Does that make sense? So I would wait for the second layer to introduce those whites. Okay, so yeah, I think everything looks really good, and you're ready to move into color. If you want to wait to add those lighter areas to the table, you could just glaze the warm kind of red oxide over the whole table, and then wait until the second color layer to reintroduce some of the lines and some of the wood grain to the table. That would be very easy to do as a scumble. Oh, okay, so your teacup is a minty green. Let me think, because it's kind of like that Viridian tablecloth that I was doing. You might, if you have a Viridian green, Viridian is a kind of it is considered transparent, but it's obviously a lighter value where it starts off compared to like a phthalo turquoise. I don't know what colors you might have, but look for one that says it's transparent, but that has a blue-green tint. And then you're just going to really thin it out. So if I went and picked out a turquoise, let me find something that's close to Viridian here. So Viridian is kind of like that out of the tube. So when you go in and apply your glaze, you're just going to thin it with medium. And when it gets placed over that really bright underpainting, it's going to take on that kind of minty quality. So just make sure that the hue is really close. Don't worry about the value, because the value is going to come from your underpainting. And you just have to make sure you thin your glaze. So I would take whatever blue-greens that you have at home, whatever colors you have, and do a couple of tests on a scrap piece of canvas, blend, kind of diluting it out with your medium, and see which one comes closest to the color of your cup, and that's the one you'll use. And you would probably pretty much glaze the entire cup with the exception of maybe where the daisy is. You can kind of just leave this grisaille color and then go back in with a more cool white later on and add that in the detail layer. Digitally, it doesn't, I mean, glazing is kind of hard to imitate. But it should have kind of an effect like that when you're finished. And that is pretty much it. Oh, wait, the background here, this edge here. I know we had talked about kind of softening out the edge. I would just go even softer with the back edge of that table. So you can do that with just like a little bit of a scumble. Again, kind of like I showed you with the orange. Try going in with a value that falls somewhere in between the table and, like you did it here, you found that value that's in between. I would just straighten this out a little bit if you can and have that slightly softer edge. One thing that's going to help pull our attention away from this corner on the left is to actually darken this background a little bit on the left. So I would say go in with something maybe even a little darker than that. Just for this lower corner. I think it'll help to kind of keep that hard dark edge of the table from pulling our eye too much. So maybe carry that over a little bit. So let's take a look and see. So that kind of brings less attention to that edge of that table, kind of pulling our eye off. This doesn't do it over here so much because the table's lighter, but over here it's so dark against such a light value. I would maybe push this down just a little bit more. Softer edges. Oh, and then whenever I have a tangent that's happening, like where this edge hits, it's right where the edge of the scalloped edge of the saucer is. There's a couple of ways to deal with that. You could just go in and lighten and soften this edge here as it kind of tucks behind the cup. That would be one way to do that, is to actually, so that this doesn't transition so drastically, maybe take some of this color and just use it back here as kind of a transition, and then it's not going to pull the eye to that spot. Or you need to make a little bit more of an obvious overlap. So maybe pull this up a little higher. It's still going to want to kind of feel like a tangent though, so I feel like softening that, making sure that that edge is nice and soft, and then kind of gradating this a little bit is going to help bring a little less attention to it. Actually, yes, the saucer is a little bit skewed. Let me bring up your reference here. So maybe what you could do is bring this up a little bit higher. Let me find the connecting kind of arc there. Let me draw that in a color we can actually see. I'm going to make that a little bit smaller. So I'm just going to use this ellipse to help us find where things need to adjust a little bit. Okay, so I'll leave that on there. So what I think you could do is probably bring this side up on the left, up to that line. Even though it's scalloped, kind of look at it as if it's not. So the scalloped edge could still be there, but it just needs to come up a little higher. And then I'd say this go a little bit wider to make it a little more symmetrical. And that will help to fix the skewed saucer. So I'm going to just take those away so you can see where your painting is and where it needs to be adjusted. Does that help? Yeah, those ellipses are tricky, especially if you have a scalloped or not perfect ellipse. The scalloped edge on that saucer, it's a little bit... I would actually, let me do something else. I think that is just a little bit too wide. Okay, I think that's a little bit more accurate. So maybe this, I'm looking at the reference here too. I think you need maybe a little more space here, down here at the bottom, right there. So maybe bring that lip down just a little bit. You might push this out a tiny bit, leave this one where it is, but push that one up. Okay. All right, I think that's pretty much it. You can start to go in and glaze. Now your background is kind of neutral. It's like a white wall. So I do feel like this is a little bit warmer than what your painting will be. Yeah, let me address that in just a minute. So with your background color, you might be wondering what to glaze it. I would just do a very pale blue to start to shift it a little cooler, but you'll probably have to go in with an opaque scumble in the following week. With regards to the cup, I think your forms are just fine. You could maybe go a tiny bit darker right down here at the kind of belly of this form here. And then just smooth out some of the transition down in here. But a lot of that can also be done in the, yeah, your background is kind of slightly blue. A lot of this subtlety too can be achieved with some adjustments in like a scumble layer too, if you want to wait to do that as well. But I think other than that, just a tiny bit of tweaking. Yeah, just soften that hard edge for that darkest shadow up here in this area. And that's pretty much it. If you wanted to go in before you add color to add the green, you could, but I really think if you just glaze the warm color and then add the scumbles later for that second layer on the table, that'll be that'll be fine for achieving that wood grain. Because you'd probably end up doing that anyway, because sometimes wood grain takes on a different hue. So you might be using like a little yellow ochre or something like that to add those lights. So there's no point in really doing it too much in this grisaille layer. Do you have any other questions? You're very welcome. I look forward to seeing your painting next week. All right, Colin, let's go ahead and talk about your piece. Now, you said some areas were sunk in. But it looks like that crimson glaze we had talked about last week really made a difference in that red fabric behind. It doesn't have that orange kind of quality that it had before. Hi, Janet. About the perspective lines on the table around the whole orange. She's not going to add those until the second color layer. So we had talked about adding those lines back in, but really, if you wanted to wait until the final color layer, you could easily add those kind of minute details later on. Okay, Colin, let's see. I can see where you started to add some warmth back into the Madonna. You talked a little bit about that. Yeah, this is looking really nice. I think another red glaze, transparent glaze in the upper part of that red, especially these cast shadows, we want to get that nice and chromatic. So you might be doing some spot glazing on that background. I would just go in with a straight cool red, like a alizarin crimson, so that way your shadows are a little bit cooler since you have such a warm light source. So you're going to go in, let me make it a little darker here. Like an alizarin crimson would be perfect for this. And then you're going to want to go in and just spot glaze some of those darks. Alizarin has a tendency, if you're using genuine alizarin crimson, it has a tendency to sink in. So that could be causing an issue too. But I would start off with that because that red is just really, really beautiful. And then anywhere that you have a little bit of this dark where it seems to be going kind of gray, just spot glaze those areas with a little bit of the alizarin. And that's going to make those shadows feel a little bit more rich. You'll notice too, the reflection here is very, very chromatic. So maybe the reflection in the wood could go darker. If you squint your eyes, it is darker than the fabric here. So you might end up going in and glazing that alizarin in there as well. And then I would even say go in with a little cad red light. So you're going to want to oil out, for example, the whole red fabric and then go in and spot glaze. But then you're going to do some spot scumbling too with a little cadmium red. I would add a little bit of alizarin into that cadmium so it doesn't go too hot or brown again, because there is some difference in cadmiums between brands. And then just go in and only hit those lightest areas where you want to add a little bit more pop to the color. I realize this is crushed velvet. I hope the little digital demo on velvet kind of helped. It is kind of a tricky fabric to paint because it has just so much modulation. I would simplify just a touch, but notice that these highlights that come up the form are very tight and kind of sharp. So I think you could go in and just add a few little areas where you might want it to pop a little bit more. Not everywhere. You want to be kind of selective about where you're adding that. Okay, so you said the pictures, it's a little darker in real life. Okay, that's good to know. And also when you're painting back in, I would suggest if you're having an issue with sinking in, oil out the whole painting, or not the whole painting, but the areas you want to work first, then go in and introduce your glaze, and you won't have to use much medium in your color. Just apply the color wet into that glaze. It's called painting into a couch. I know it sounds weird, but that's what it's called. And so since you had oiled out already, you're just going to paint that glaze in and blend it into that medium. And then you'll have those kind of seamless edges between those areas. And by oiling it out first, all those true colors are going to come back from the areas that are sunk in. This area, for example, looks very sunk in over here. So I pretty much assume that you realize that that's going to be darker and warmer. I would say you could probably take a warm kind of yellowish color, very, very diluted, and maybe glaze over your whites a little bit and warm those up a touch. That's going to help as well. I realize we were talking about brightening some areas and darkening others, so you might try a transparent. I would say take like an Indian yellow, but dilute it a lot because Indian yellow is very, very potent. And then add a tiny touch of like a neutral brown. You could even use umber, but a very, very small amount to make kind of a, or maybe even red oxide, kind of an amber color, and then glaze over your whites and make them a little bit warmer. I think that's going to help bring that kind of warmth back into the painting as well. And I think you could do that like a second glaze layer to those shadows here on the Madonna. Very, very thin. Push that contrast with that red oxide ochre mix and just lightly glaze just the shadows. You're not necessarily going one much darker, but you're just warming it up a little bit. Let's see, a couple of other areas where you'll want to kind of solidify your glaze. I would say maybe a little transparent red oxide glaze over some of these areas on the painting that's laying there. I think you can go darker, like with this cast shadow. So remember, as you're moving into glazing, it's very easy to go back in and lighten things up too much. Just squint your eyes and look for those value groupings. This looks great. You got that nice gradient here. If you want this to be a richer color, I would glaze over it with a, it almost has an ochre color, but I think you could use Indian yellow with a touch of red oxide and get that nice and warm as well. A very similar color to what we have down here, or even here. You might want to make an orange to glaze into the wood there and just resaturate that area. You have a lot of white, so those colors where you have that rich saturation, you really want to punch those up a little bit more to help balance the painting a little bit. I would even say, yeah, you could do the same with like a Viridian here, and just even over some of those highlights, just do a very thin veil of that green. You have a really nice sense of it up here, so maybe just carry that down into the body of this. So when you're painting tinted glass, even with the exception of the specular highlights, everything's going to have a little bit of that tint. There's areas where it's a little less saturated, but everything's going to have a little bit of that tint. So you want to make sure to have that in there as well. I think part of your feather could go a little bit darker, or maybe a little warmer in the shadow. Maybe try glazing a slightly warmer color just in that dark part so that you have a little more of a dynamic color shift for the feather. And then I want you to start looking, as you're moving into color, pay attention to edges. So you're getting to that finishing stage, and edges are really, really crucial, and I talk about that in the lecture this week, is how to balance your level of detail and also the edge quality to keep the focal point where you want it. So anything that's peripheral, any edges that are moving off the canvas, we've talked about this before, and you've done that like here in the fabric, like right over here, having those softer edges. You do have those nice sharp edges right in the scale, which is, I would say, one of the primary focal points apart from the Madonna. So just remember to step back from your painting, and if an area is pulling your eye too much, think about how you can refocus where you want the viewer to look. Obviously, there's multiple focal points in a still life, but a great way is to kind of soften your eyes a little bit by partially squinting and looking at your painting and just kind of surveying the whole thing, taking it in without focusing too much on one particular area. and ask yourself if anything's grabbing the eye too much, whether that's from a value being incorrect, or if it's usually it's like a sharp edge or too much modulation in the values for that area. A great example of that would be like if you had too many reflected lights happening in a shadow, things don't feel unified, and then it looks like it's a more detailed area. So the more variety you have in an area, the more it's going to feel detailed. So think about that as you move forward as well. I'm just squinting, looking at your reference, and I think one suggestion I would have is to soften this edge over here along the blue. Let me just get a ink pen here. So just this edge here, you actually have a nice semi-soft edge kind of moving over, and actually because the values of these two adjacent, it's not pulling my eye too much, but because you have such a white value here and then such a dark value here, you want to make sure you have just a slightly softer edge. And an area where you could probably simplify, like would be, an example would be in the bottle here. So where you have this little spot of dark, I would maybe just blend that out and look at where you can take some of those areas that are kind of high contrast or textured and bring them a little bit more smooth. Give the area, think of it as like having areas in the painting where the eyes can rest, and areas where the painting is busy. So if we have too much busyness everywhere and too much like kind of hard edges or detailed areas spread out, it's very easy to kind of distract the viewer, and it kind of hurts our eyes. I talked a little bit about that in the lecture on balancing details. So just keep that in mind. Think about how much information and where you can give those eyes, or your viewers' eyes, areas to rest to help balance the painting. Typically those are shadows. I like to think of shadows as being more mysterious and less detailed, and that typically gives that nice balance between detail and simplification. All right, and those are my suggestions. Do you have any questions? So you can see just the subtle difference that simplifying some of those areas has made. All right, so if you don't have any further questions, I know there's a little bit of a lag between me talking and you being able to type out your question, but go ahead and add it if you do have one. But I'm going to open up the floor to everyone just one more time before we end our session today, and you can post your questions, and I will start with you, Rosa. So you said, do you need to address the halo that's created by oiling out beyond the element that you are working on, or will the varnish take care of that? That's a great question. It depends on the medium that you're using to oil out. Some mediums, for example, the ones that I'm using and the ones I suggest, they dry to a satin or semi-gloss finish. Oftentimes they will also sink back in and dry matte. That will be kind of resolved by varnishing later. But if you're using something like Galkyd Light or Galkyd Regular, it's a very, very glossy medium. So if you only used it in select areas, you're going to have these really glossy spots. And I've had this happen in my paintings, which is one of the reasons I don't use that medium unless you're going to use it everywhere, throughout every layer, which keeps everything glossy. You want to be consistent with that medium throughout the whole thing because it has that glossy effect. I'll give an example. I had done a self-portrait and I didn't use Gal Kid throughout most of the painting until the very end. I had oiled out just an area right around where the hair met the background and I wanted to paint back in. And then I had this really glossy strip, and no matter how many layers of varnish I applied, that area still looked more glossy than the rest. And that's a problem, so I had to remove all of the layers of varnish and then apply Gal Kid over the whole painting to even out that gloss, and even then it still didn't quite even it out. So I tend to avoid the glossy mediums. I stick with ones that are more like the Neomegalp or the Gal Kid Gel. That one's more satin finished. Even just regular linseed oil can be more satin finished, so you don't have that issue so much. It will tend to, so one of the things that I talk about at the end of this week's lesson is oiling out your entire painting when you're finished with it. Let's say you consider yourself done, and other areas of your painting are a couple of weeks old, they're sunk in. It's really kind of hard to tell if the painting has that even finish. Or even like sometimes you might have retouched an area and accidentally went in with the wrong value, and then when you varnish it, you start to see where those areas are. So my suggestion is let your painting dry really well, let your glazes dry very thoroughly, a couple of weeks, and then go over with whatever medium you were using. You don't want to apply it really thick, but you can apply a very thin veil over the entire painting, kind of oil it out. You could use linseed oil, or you could use the medium that you're using. I used my Gal Kid gel for my still life, and I oiled out the entire painting so that I could see the whole thing as if it will look when it's varnished. And if I see any areas that need retouching, then I can still go back in and paint into that if I need to. Once you apply a varnish, you can't go in on top and paint. So you can't make those corrections on top of a varnish. So there's the benefit to oiling out first. And then letting that dry, and that will help to also even out the whole surface a little bit before you apply a varnish. Some varnishes like Gamvar by Gamblin, which is the one I use, it's not the best at evening out really drastically different surface areas. So for example, if you use their Gamvar gloss, you will see other areas that are really sunk in. They will sink in after the first coat of varnish again, just slightly. And so to help prevent that from happening, they recommend oiling out your entire painting first, letting that dry, and then doing your varnish. I actually use a satin varnish on my paintings. I don't like really high gloss. It has its place, but personally I like a kind of a semi-gloss or a satin finish. I find it just works the best for my work. It gives enough depth to the shadows, and it also allows there isn't too much reflection, because I work on smooth surfaces. There isn't too much reflection or those specular lights that hit when your painting is lit in a gallery. You know, any dust that settles on that glossy surface is going to really show up. So with a satin finish, you tend to avoid that issue as well. That's just me personally. I've come up with that. And I can talk about that in a varnish video. But I typically just make my own satin. I don't even use, Gamvar offers a satin one, but their satin is too satin for me. I'm kind of picky. So I make my own dissolving cold wax medium into some Gamsol, and then I pour that about 2/3 Gamvar to 1/3 solution of the cold wax medium in Gamsol, and that will create just the right satin finish that I like, and that's what I use. So I make my own. Okay, so does anyone have any further questions? Okay guys, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. Thank you for joining in, and I look forward to seeing all of your guys' work next week. If you guys have questions midweek as you're working, of course, get in touch. Oh, Janet, you had a question. When using Galkid gel medium, how many days between first color layer and second? 80 degrees where you live. Oh, well, you're lucky that it's so warm because it's going to dry very quickly. But it will depend on the color that you're using too, because certain colors dry quicker than others. And so a good example is when I was filming this course, and I thought I was going to go back in and do my second color layer. I realized that that first color layer where I had used the Viridian, it was not dry. And I'd grabbed my painting and put a nice big thumbprint in my glaze. So I had to go in and touch that up, but it will depend heavily on partly the medium does speed up the drying, but the pigment that you're using, some pigments dry much slower than others. I think I mentioned this last week. Titanium white's very, very slow drying compared to lead white. Well, there's a difference between pigments too, and there's like cadmiums can take a really long time. Even alizarin crimson can take a long time to dry sometimes. So if your painting can sit in a warmer environment, that is ideal because it will dry a little bit quicker. Oil paints don't dry by evaporation, which is how like acrylic or water-based media dries. You know, the water evaporates out of the medium and it dries, it hardens. Oil paints cure, and they actually never stop curing over time, which is why sometimes your painting, not your painting, but a painting might not show cracks in the beginning, but give it, 50 years and it starts to show up some cracking. It's because paintings cure by oxidation, and so it's absorbing oxygen, and paint actually expands slightly over time using that absorbing oxygen, and that's how it cures. And the reason why a warmer environment will help your painting cure quicker is not because of heat directly in the sense of evaporation, but it's because more the oxygen is moving more quickly in a warm environment and it gets absorbed quicker. So it's a subtle difference, but some pigments take longer, especially in a colder environment. I used to speed dry my paintings when I lived in Southern California by sticking them in my car and parking my car in the sun, because it would get to a toasty, 100 degrees in my car. And that's actually not dangerous for your painting. I would not recommend sticking your painting in the oven. Some people do that, but I don't recommend it. But you can stick your painting in your car in a tub with a lid and just let it bake in there, and it will dry quicker. So you could park your car in the sun and stick your painting in there in that 80-degree weather, and it'll probably get warmer in there and dry your painting a little bit faster. Sometimes that Galkid gel medium, I've noticed just on average, it'll dry well enough to go back in within 3 days. I would say give it at least 3 days, because you don't want to go back in and start painting back into it with more Galkid and have it dissolve the glaze underneath, because then you get this weird kind of ring that happens around where the glaze lifted, and it's really hard to fix and hide. So I would just give it plenty of time, and definitely test it by touching the surface. It should not, and even test like by oiling out a small area with your Galkid gel. And if it's not lifting the glaze, then you're fine and you can move into painting. All right, guys, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. Thank you so much, and I will see you guys next week. So the class has ended. I'm going to just reiterate this, those who came in later. The lessons are finished. You got your final week's lessons this week, but we have 2 more weeks of critique. So we will have critique next weekend and the weekend after. All right, thank you so much, and I'll see you guys next week.